Well, here is my presentation on the cosmic gospel and its universal and yet particular message. And so I'm going to be doing a presentation on the gospel in a guilt innocence culture. So I've chosen this culture because it's the culture that I am doing ministry in right now. I live in Caledonia, Michigan, and this is profoundly the culture that I live in. I took that test, and I would say that I answered the questions like according to how my community would answer them, and not just how I would answer them. And it was like 80%, 88% guilt innocence culture. And so I just want to begin by sharing a few stories uh, with of like, okay, how does this guilt innocence culture show in itself in our world in Caledonia? Well, first up, in ministry, one of the things that I have the privilege of doing is doing one-on-one discipleship with people. And so one of the things that often will come up is like if someone's going through a crisis in their life, they'll say to me, "What am I doing wrong?" And I just had this, 2 weeks ago. And what they're thinking is like my action, I must have done something wrong somewhere in me. I did something, and that is the root cause of all the problems. You also hear someone say like I did something wrong, and one of the things that stuck out to me from the book by Jason George's The 3D Gospel was his line that guilt needs no audience. And so this person who comes to me and says I did something wrong is profoundly feeling the fact that yeah, I've sinned, uh, and it's causing a lot of guilt in my life, and it's eating me up inside. And so this is this type of thing that I hear in just ministry in a guilt innocence culture. But also, as I thought about it, I'm now a parent of kids, and we're getting to the age now where we really have to be intentional about how we parent. And I can't help but see in my own parenting, well, the reflection of the guilt innocence culture around me. So one of the things that my wife and I say a lot is simply, we don't do that. We don't do that. And so like if my daughter is grabbing my dog's tail and pulling on it, we say, Kinley, we don't do that. And what that shows us is that we almost have an individualistic sense of what is right, right? Now, like what I'm saying is like we don't do that. Is it we don't do that. So we don't pull on dogs' tails, but almost like I'm almost implying that others might, even though I'm not advocating for that at all. But it shows that we are an individualized culture, right? Because it's we don't do that. Like that's not an acceptable behavior in this culture. And again, it's kind of going back to the action there as well. Next, we'll also say like give it back. And so like if my daughter has stolen something, or like I just think of like the TV remote, and I say, Kinley, give it back. Like there's a sense of justice, like righting the wrong. And then there's also simply the say you're sorry, because in this culture, confession brings restoration. That's how our culture works. And so here's a couple takeaways of like a guilt innocence culture. Number one, value is derived from right actions. And so what we do, our morality, these things have a tremendous impact on how we view ourselves and how much value we have within the community. Second, when a wrong is committed, we're supposed to seek justice, or that's kind of like our response, right? And we see this in many, many ways in our culture. But overall, you see it as simple as like kids on a playground. If a kid punches another kid, the other kid's response is usually to try to fight back and to punch back. But so we see that sense of justice when a wrong is committed. Next, confession leads to alleviation of guilt. And again, this is not necessarily a bad thing at all, or not anything that's out of step with the gospel, but because confession does bring alleviation of guilt. But this is no less a huge part of our culture where we see people entering restored relationships after they've done some confession and some reconciliation after the wrong has happened. And so, how does the gospel then meet, or what might meet the guilt innocence culture in a particular way? Well, appreciate the story in John chapter 8, and let me read verses 1 through 11. But Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. At dawn, he appeared again in the temple courts where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in an act of adultery. In the law of Moses, in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now, what do you say?" They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." Again, he stooped down and wrote on the ground. At this, those who heard began to go away one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left with the woman still standing there. And so there's a lot of things that this story shows us. We'll just start by like, okay, the Pharisees have that profound sense of justice that they want to see done. They call back to the law that Moses gave them. And it was that, well, if a woman is caught in an act of adultery, well, we are supposed to stone them. A wrong has happened, and now we got to seek justice. So they want that woman to pay the price for the wrong that she's done. However, what Jesus is saying is no one is perfectly good. In fact, we've all done actions that are worthy of punishment. We've all sinned. I think of Romans, we have all fallen short of the glory of God. Um, and so if we again put this in the larger biblical framework, it's the reality that we've all committed sins that make us worthy of death, right? But that's not what the gospel is, and that's not the gospel as seen in this text, right? Because you see Jesus saying to this woman, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir. No one, sir." "Then neither do I condemn you." And so the gospel in a guilt innocence culture, then. Well, first, our value doesn't come from the things we do, but from the God who saved us. And that's incredibly key in a guilt innocence culture. And that actually puts us out of step with our culture. That's the pilgrim principle, right? Because so much of our culture is wrapped in about what we do and what we produce and making sure that that is the best thing. Well, this is a story of like this is your value is not derived from what you do, but actually the God who saved you. And this woman Jesus showed incredible kindness to, and it was on no merit of her own. Next, justice in this sense is taken care of by Jesus. And here's what I mean by this. It means that like, okay, we've all sinned and we are all worthy of death, but Jesus Christ was the one who took on that punishment for us. And so he fulfilled all the demands of justice. He took care of them in full 100%. So there's no justice to be taken out on my own on me because Christ took my place. There's no ounce of God's wrath for me to bear because Christ took my place. And this again is another like thing where it's really the pilgrim principle of like this is out of step with the message of our culture. Because again, we almost function with like the cancel culture mindset, which isn't all that different than the eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. Right? If you commit a wrong, then an equal wrong should hit you. Well, this is this idea that Jesus took on and paid for all the demands of my wrong. Well, that's the pilgrim principle right there for sure. And then lastly, there is a right way of living that does lead to life. Um, and so I'll go back now actually to this. So Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir." She said. "Then neither do I condemn you." Jesus declared, "Go now and leave your life of sin." And so, okay, there is this line at the end, go and now and leave your life of sin. There is this real element that God calls us into a new life, into a transformed life. And and there is a right way of living that does lead to life, and that's that transformed life. And so this is really something that we can be in step with our culture on, right? Because there is this real thing called sin, even though our culture is actually a little bit going away from that aspect. But there is a real thing called sin. There is a real right way of living. We see it in God's law, and in God's law, we find true freedom. We find our really human flourishing. And so Jesus calling this woman, okay, go and sin no more. That keys into that principle of like, yes, there is a right way of living and it does lead to life. Okay. Then I'm going to go now to some implications for our evangelism as we engage with this culture. First up, this book, Models of Evangelism by Priscilla Pope Levinson. Uh, in it, she says this, and we're talking about lifestyle evangelism here, and that's just like the whole life evangelism. She says this: lifestyle encompasses everything about us, what clothes we wear, what food we eat, where we live and work, whom we spend time with, and uh, how we organize our day. Whether we recognize it or not, our lifestyle requires countless choices each day and every day, and it communicates what we hold most dear and what we prioritize. Whether we recognize it or not, people notice our lifestyle and draw conclusions about us from it. This happens everywhere, including in the workplace. And so, my takeaway from that quote from her was that personal evangelism is key in such an individualized culture. I mentioned it at the beginning with, parenting my daughter when I said we don't do that, right? We live in such an individualized culture that I think personal evangelism is key, because if we really believe that the gospel is this multifaceted diamond, it not only speaks to all cultures, but it also meets each person. And again, this is kind of like a way that it's this idea of like the gospel is in step with our culture because it meets everyone where they are and their individual needs. At the lowest of their lows, it meets them there for sure. And so then our way of life as Christians, the circles that we inhabit, our right living in a sense, is key to reaching people in our circles. Because again, we can trust that the gospel will meet people individually where they are at. Next is this idea of small group evangelism from her book. And this is her quote: small groups, in contrast, return Christians to a more portable, pliable faith to be shared with others in a more intimate setting. So, one of the beauties of small group ministries is that so many have cultures within them, right? And again, that speaks to our individualized culture that you can find your own small group that fits your wants and your desires. We might not have an evangelism small group like Pope Levinson recommends, but our small groups can be evangelistic in the way we invite others into the fold. You see, this idea of small group evangelism actually challenges the mold of our culture to seek individualism, to seek going at it alone. But if we invite people into these spaces where the gospel is being preached and taught and lived out in our lifestyles, well, that will profoundly challenge the individualized culture that we so often trend to in the guilt innocence culture. And so, yeah, that is the gospel to the guilt innocence culture. Thank you for taking the time to listen. I really appreciate it.